Hello and welcome to another episode of our Brothers Creed podcast. We're talking about motivation, experiences, and exploring the world around us. We're the Thomas Brothers. I'm Ethan.
And I'm Jared. And today we're going to talk about some interesting, lesser-known wars that have occurred around the world, and some of them you may have never even heard of. Ethan's got a couple. I've got one or two. And these are interesting histories that you may not know about. And we love sharing war stories. And these are just so interesting, especially right now with the war going on in Ukraine. Wars in a lot of people's minds. So we're going to talk about some of these lesser-known ones and maybe the impact that they had. So let's go ahead and dive in.
All right, let's do it.
Spartans! What is your profession?
Any man who must say, I am the king, is no true king.
What I do have are a very particular set of skills. Skills that make me a nightmare.
If I can change, and you can change, everybody can change!
Let us all unite! Let us fight for a new world, a decent world.
All right, so the first war we're going to talk about, and maybe we should coin the term micro war.
Micro wars between micronations.
Yeah, we did an episode on micronations. These are micro wars, right? So some of these are maybe more bigger or smaller than others. But the first one that I want to talk about is the AngloZanzibar War. Okay, sounds pretty cool.
Zanzibar is in Africa, right?
Yeah. So this is in August of 1896, and there was a brief conflict between the British Empire and the East African island of Zanzibar.
East African. So that's on, where is that exactly is that located?
So, I mean, I would say maybe that's kind of over in
is it Madagascar, or is it more northern?
No, I think it's more northern. I think it's maybe like what is that, the Dead Sea or the Red Sea up there in that area, kind of off to the east. I don't know.
Okay. Next to Libya.
Yeah. So basically, following the death of the current Sultan of Zanzibar, Prince Khalid, he refused to. He was kind of a noble in Zanzibar, and he refused to accept the British Empire's preferred successor to the Sultan that had just passed away. The British Empire basically, they had colonized Zanzibar, and they were, the British Empire at that point, they colonized everybody, right? And so they had, this was a very important part of some specific trade routes, and that's why the British Empire wanted it so bad. And so they tried to kind of place their own puppet leader, their puppet sultan, after the main guy died. Well, this Khalid guy, he wasn't having it. So instead, he forcefully occupied the sultan's palace. And this prompted the Imperial cruisers, so that's some battleships, right, that they had at that
time.
Those
are the big walkers, right?
Yeah, the Imperial March, yeah. So I mean, this was the late 1800s, so they had clipper ships or whatever, the big sailing ships that had big cannons and guns on it. Uh-huh. But they fired upon the palace that this Khalid guy had taken over, and some crazy stuff happened. So there was a lot of political unrest in this country, and the sultanhood had kind of bounced back and forth, but finally this guy died, and the British tried to put in this successor who they wanted him to be malleable, a malleable sultan that would not oppose us, is what they wanted.
So like every single president we've ever tried to put, the U.S. has ever tried to put in any other country.
Yeah. So this Khalid guy, he had actually attempted to overthrow the throne before, but had failed. But once the main sultan had died, this Khalid guy, he took over the palace with nearly 3,000 of the sultan's personal guards. personal soldiers and supporters. So he had this whole compound, right? The palace was, and he had it surrounded by 3,000 plus soldiers. And they had a small battery of artillery and an armed royal yacht named the Glasgow that was in the harbor nearby. And the harbor, it's an island, right? And I was looking at a map of it, and the harbor was kind of right off of this peninsula that the palace sat on. And so the British, they had about 900 men, including some of the men from Zanzibar that didn't want this new Sultan guy. And they had 5 powerful Royal Navy vessels that were in the harbor. And so the British admiral that was over the men at that point, the British Navy vessels, he sent an ultimatum to this Khalid guy who had taken over the palace. And he instructed him and his troops to exit the palace grounds and surrender their arms by 9 a.m. the next day on August 27th, or succumb to British firepower, he said. So this Khalid guy refused, believing that the British would not actually follow through with the threat because he thought that they would just try to maintain the peace or whatever else. But true to his word, 9 o'clock came the next morning, and he opened fire on the palace. And so the whole palace quickly engulfed in flames. The one armed yacht that was the Zanzibar yacht, the Glasgow that was in the harbor, fired on one of the British ships, and they all just turned and just like blasted that ship and disarmed. I mean, just completely like didn't sink it, but I mean they just completely crippled the ship.
Yeah.
And 500 casualties were inflicted on Khalid's soldiers by the time the British ceased fire 40 minutes later. So this war, right, this battle in this war with this guy who of Zanzibar who declared war on the British, basically, it lasted 40 minutes, actually 38 minutes.
With 500 casualties.
With 500 casualties, and then it was done.
And then they stopped firing, and then they're like, you guys done yet? And he's like, yeah, we're done.
Yeah. So by the afternoon, the British had the Sultan of their choice, whose name was Hamund, properly, or they had put him in. By the afternoon, they had put him in power, and he promptly agreed to all the terms that the British required him to agree to.
Yeah, I bet he did.
So this Khalid guy actually escaped into exile, and he lived in exile, but was arrested by the British during World War I, and he died in 1927.
Oh,
yeah,
that's crazy.
So, kind of interesting.
When was the war?
1896.
Oh, interesting.
So, kind of a final thing to that is said, with Zanzibar having suffered gravely at the hands of a mere fraction of the British Empire's military power, no further revolutions occurred on the island until Britain pulled back their protection status in 1963. So there was basically the British just controlled ultimately up until they just said, okay, you can have your country back. Right. After that, the people were just stunned, and they were just like, if this is what 5 ships can do, I mean,
yeah.
So,
man,
kind of a cool story. So
that is interesting.
That is the shortest recorded war between countries in all history.
Huh. Interesting. That's kind of cool. This one that I was going to them talking about is something that happened in the United States that I had no idea about. This is the Comanche Mexican War, and this happened between the years of 1821 to 1870. So almost 49 years. This is a long war.
That is a long time.
And it kind of goes back to the original dynamics of the Wild West and how that happened, especially within the northern Mexico areas. So, in the Mexicans and Mexico City, kind of in the year 1835, Mexico gained its independence in the year 1821, and after Mexico gained its independence from Spain, they were super poor, right? And so they didn't have many means to really protect their borders or really do anything. And so these Comanche, which had a pretty big presence. Now, Comanche, they're an Indian group. They used to be Shoshone, but after the Spanish had released a bunch of horses on the plains, they kind of became a horse riding people. So kind of like the Riders of Rohan, if you will.
Exactly like that.
More like actually the Raiders of Rohan, because they're more like Vikings. And they would be on the plains riding horses. The Utes Indians called them the Comanche, which in their language meant enemy people. And the Spanish called them Norteños, but then they started calling them Comanche as well. And now the Comanche, they had a large territory in New Mexico, Oklahoma, some of Kansas, Texas was a major piece of it. It was a big area that they were on. And so what they started doing is they started raiding Mexico. They started coming down and they would frequently raid haciendas. Haciendas like kind of like a small ranch or a farm, and they would in the northern part of Mexico. The haciendas, right after they gained their independence, the government was like, "We can't help you, so you're fend for yourself." So everybody was like batting down the hatches, no one would go anywhere, and everybody was so scared, you know. At one point, the local governments in Mexico offered a bounty of 100 pesos per Comanche scalp.
Really?
Isn't that crazy? A bounty for someone's scalp. Kind of crazy. Makes you think like, wow, we live in some great times. So why the hostility? What's up with Comanches? What's up with that? So the Comanches had to compete for lots of resources, scarce resources, as the Americans would only trade with other kind of northern tribes like the Cherokee and I think the Shoshone. And the Comanche had the Mexicans to trade with, but since they had gotten their independence, they weren't as wealthy or well off. Also, the Trail of Tears kind of ended in Oklahoma, so the U.S. government pushed all these Indians, these Native Americans, all the way out, and they just dumped them in Oklahoma. And so that's where the Comanche stomping grounds were. And in fact, a funny story that happened was there was a Catholic priest that said, "What is up with these Comanches? They're acting crazy." And an Apache Indian tribe said, "They need the word of God. You need to go put a church over in this area, and they need to be converted to Christianity." And so they went and put a church there, and they all got slaughtered by Comanches. And the Apaches like, "See you guys."
Didn't want you on our territory.
Yeah,
so.
exactly. And so, that was kind of funny. Well, not funny, but it's
that kind of when the Jehovah's Witness knock on the door and you're like, "Oh no, but the neighbors want to talk to you."
Yeah. This area was getting really crunched in, and also the buffalo were being killed off by mass. Also, drought was killing the buffalo, so they had really scarce resources. So that's why they were very hostile. And so they were basically Vikings. They became almost like Viking raiders into Mexico. They started small with parties of 10 to 20 men, but then they grew to almost raiding parties of hundreds of men, going as far as 400 miles south of the Rio Grande. So they would cross the Rio Grande, and they would just go into Mexico. They would steal cattle, women, children, food, crops, anything they could carry, and then anything they couldn't, they would just burn it or destroy it or kill it. They took an estimated over 100,000 head of livestock. And then later on, I think it was almost 700 I'll share the statistics after the whole war is done at the end. But the legislature for Chihuahua described the situation it faced in 1846. Quote, "We traveled the roads at the Comanche and Apaches, whim, and cultivated the lands where they wish and in the amounts they wish. We use sparingly things that they have left us until the moment that it strikes their appetite to take for themselves." So, I mean, this is like
constantly living in fear.
constantly, yeah. And so they said that at one point the Comanches were striding down the middle of the street in the capital of Durango, Mexico, and nobody could do anything to stop them. And so why was it so difficult is because the Mexicans couldn't. The Mexicans were like, well, we need to stop this stuff. But Texas at the time had just gained their independence as its own independent country. And so they're like, well, to go stop them in their own territory, we'd have to cross into Texas. And the Texans aren't going to like a bunch of Mexicans armed to the teeth walking into their territory, trying to kill the Comanches. Also, logistically, you'd have to tell these men that their families are going to be protected because they're leaving their families, and everything is like a war zone already. And then, there's going to be no meat because there's no meat on those plains. There's nothing out there, so we're going to have to bring cattle with us. And then what if the Comanches are poisoning the water holes? And then how are we going to eat? And it's just like, what about the winter? And so logistically, it was very difficult to try to figure out how to put a campaign together to go get them at their home. And so that was why it just continued and continued. By the late 1860s, northern Mexico was basically a permanent wasteland that was basically ransacked constantly. The Comanches, like I said, they were just in charge of everything. A travel writer from that time, and in 1847, this is a little bit earlier than that, he said, from the borders of New Mexico to Durango, it's almost entirely depopulated, and most haciendas have been abandoned. So these guys...
People were just fleeing south.
South. And in fact, I'll share at the end how many... It was 358 settlements that had been abandoned.
Wow.
And so after the... So how did this kind of end? Well, after the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo article, there was a treaty between America and the Mexicans that gave basically half of Mexico's land to the United States, which is what I think Santana signed it, right? And so Article 11 says that the U.S. should end the Comanche incursions in Mexico. And the U.S. wasn't able to do that very well. They were able to curtail maybe some of it at the beginning. The raids just continued, and there was over 366 claims made by Mexicans against the U.S. for damages for breaking Article 11. So it definitely continued. But there were some things that the U.S. did to kind of end that war. So, and there was also some things that happened to the Comanches that really wound this 50-year war down. And those were, they had reached the peak. Well, the Comanches had reached the peak of their power in the 1840s. So that's when they were like the biggest. But authorities in 1856 claimed that the Comanche raids had killed, this is some of the statistics here, had killed over 6,000 people and had abducted 748 people. So they're taking slaves back, and forced the abandonment of 358 settlements. So so a lot of factors changed, like I was saying. First of all, the prairies changed. They turned into farmlands. Fences went up. These people were nomadic, so they couldn't quite roam as easily. The U.S. Army also put up several frontier outposts in Comanche territory, which made it very difficult for them to get around freely. That was some factor. Also, another major factor is there was an outbreak of cholera that killed lots of them. Also, there was a big drought, which caused the buffalo to die out, and also the buffalo hunting to die out, so that they were now having to eat their own horses. So they were eating their own horses, which was their mode of transportation, and it kind of killed a little bit of that lifestyle that they were trying to live. Immediately after the American Civil War, the Comanches were relocated onto a reservation in Oklahoma and Texas. So the U.S. government was like, "Hey, here's your spot. Stay there." So their nomadic ways of the Comanche came to an end, and the last Mexican raid occurred in 1870. By the 1870s, they had been reduced by disease and demoralization to the point where only about 1,000, 1,500 Comanches even were alive.
Interesting.
So it's interesting how this war wasn't won necessarily by fighting back. It was won by a
So much as,
loss
like,
of resources,
time.
death, famine. Yeah, they just ran out of. They weren't living in a stable society. They were just raiders, and so when they had nothing left to raid, they had no resources.
Yeah.
So they died out.
That's interesting.
That's a major war that I never even knew happened in the United States.
Yeah, that's not one that you hear about.
No, it's not, because it didn't really affect us as much. It mostly just absolutely decimated Mexico.
Yeah, New Mexico. Huh.
But northern New Mexico, Arizona, those places too.
That's crazy.
So yeah.
So another one that I had that was kind of interesting was this is kind of I guess a war for a stupid reason, right? And so this one's called the War of the Stray Dog. And so this was the time when a dog inadvertently triggered an international crisis. So basically, there had been a long period of hostility between Greece and Bulgaria. They had been at odds with each other since the early 1900s. I guess what was the Balkan War was in 1910, and tensions were just really, really high between Greece and Bulgaria. So finally, this boiled over in October of 1925 when a Greek soldier was shot because he crossed the border into Bulgaria chasing his runaway dog. So he was chasing his dog that was running away, crossed the border, and he got shot. So
shot heard around the world.
Yeah. So the shooting really became like a rallying cry for Greece, and it was kind of like, they don't care about us. They're shooting our people willy-nilly. They're attacking us, and so Greece actually used this shooting as a rally cry to invade Bulgaria, and this is in 1925. So they invaded Bulgaria and actually occupied several of the large villages on the border. And they actually even set to they commenced shelling of Petrich, which I guess is maybe the capital of Bulgaria. And so they were actually bombing the city. They were shelling the city when the League of Nations finally intervened and condemned the attack. And kind of an international committee helped to negotiate a ceasefire between Greece and Bulgaria. But during the battle that they had, I guess they said 50 soldiers died during this fighting that they had. I don't know how many civilians died if they actually were bombing a city. I don't know. In 1925, were they shooting cannons over? I don't know how advanced, I don't know. But yeah, say 50 people died from it. So I didn't actually know what the League of Nations was. I had to research into that. But basically, the League of Nations was an international organization that was headquartered in Geneva, right, in Switzerland.
Like a precursor to NATO or something?
Yeah, in Switzerland, and they created the first. They were created after the First World War to provide kind of an international committee that would help resolve disputes across the world. So kind of interesting, but yeah, it's just this whole war. Basically, it was a tinderbox anyway. Yeah. But it was just this one thing. This guy let his dog loose, went running across the border, got himself shot, and that was all it needed. That was the spark that the tinderbox needed to just light up.
It reminds me of the League of Shadows. Is that from Batman?
Yes.
Is that Ra's al Ghul?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The League of Nations.
Yeah, it's so funny. This one's similar to the one I have. This one, I'm going to test your brain here, test your memory.
Oh, geez. Okay.
This is called the Pig War.
Okay.
And it's basically a war over slaughtered swine. What other major feud began with a pig? We did a podcast episode on this.
I don't know.
The Hatfields and McCoys.
Oh yeah, that's true.
The whole thing.
It was a stolen pig, wasn't it?
Yeah, because of the stolen pig. Yeah. So this one is it's called the Pig War, and it was named over the slaughtering of a swine that led to a full-scale conflict between the United States and Great Britain. So the controversy began in 1859 on San Juan Island, a chunk of land between the mainland United States and Vancouver Island. At the time, the island was home to American settlers and British employees of the Hudson Bay Company. And both parties had laid claim to its fertile soil. The first and only shots of the Pig War came on June 15th, 1859, when the American farmer named Lyman Cutler gunned down a British-owned black boar after he discovered the animal rooting his potato patch.
So the black boar is the pig.
The pig was the black boar. And he's, get that boar out of my potatoes. And that boar was owned by a British guy. So the ensuing argument over the dead hog increased tensions between the two groups of settlers. And Cutler was eventually threatened with arrest. He was the guy who shot the boar.
What year was this?
1859.
Okay.
So the same years that the Comanches were raiding the Mexicans. The
Post-Revolutionary War, pre-Civil War.
Yeah. After the Americans reported the incident to the military, the U.S. Army dispatched Captain George Pickett. Does that name sound familiar to you?
No.
Later a Confederate general in the Civil War, to San Juan. Pickett was to San Juan with a small complement of troops. Pickett upped the ante by declaring the whole island U.S. property, and British responded by sending a fleet of heavily armed naval vessels to the coastline. An absurd standoff ensued, and the situation remained on a knife's edge for several agonizing weeks. The two nations would finally negotiate a deal allowing for joint military occupation of San Juan Island in October 1859, ending the Pig War as a bloodless stalemate. So that
interesting.
The only casualty in that war was
The pig.
the pig, but it definitely escalated. Pickett was a major general in the Civil War.
Yeah.
So
Well, when somebody's pig is rutting in my potatoes,
them potatoes worth $20.
yeah, I gotta feed my family with them taters, and now I'm gonna feed my family with bacon.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's funny, just these small incidents. They're just flashpoints. They're the straw that broke the camel's back. you know? People are like, I'm done with this. This is it. It's gone too far.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like it's just there. At some point, people are just looking for an excuse. I have one more here. It's called the Pastry War. So this is in 1828. This was in Mexico. There was some angry mobs that were destroying large parts of Mexico City during this. There was this massive military coup that was going on, and kind of unrestlessness in Mexico City.
You said 1820?
1828, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And so there was this French guy who was he was an expat from France, and he had he was a pastry chef, and his name was Remontel, and he had a small cafe in Mexico City, and his cafe was looted and ransacked and destroyed by these mobs in Mexico City. And so he actually petitioned the Mexican government after things settled down, and he sent multiple complaints saying, look, during this whole thing, I suffered. My whole livelihood, my cafe got destroyed and ransacked and everything.
Is it mostly peaceful protest?
Yeah, mostly. Yeah, tell that to AutoZone or what was it?
Yeah, or Foot Locker, whoever.
Yeah, Target. Yeah. So Remontel actually, so they just ignored him. The Mexican government just ignored him. They didn't say anything. They just ignored him. And so he actually petitioned the French government for compensation because he was French and he was an expatriate or an expat. And basically he said, hey, France, Mexico is not playing fair with your citizens and your countrymen. Can you guys pay for this? Pay for my livelihood. And so his request went basically unnoticed in France for about 10 years. Finally, when it came to the attention of King Louis Philippe, the king was already furious with Mexico because they had failed to repay millions and millions of dollars in loans to France. And he was not happy with them. And so he actually he wrote back to Mexico 10 years later, and he demanded that they pay this Remontel guy, the pastry chef, 600,000 pesos as compensation for his pastry, his cafe loss. I don't know what that compares to in today money, but when the Mexican government heard this, they were like, "Puh, yeah, right." They balked at the handing over such an astronomical sum to one man, and so the king was like, the king of France was like, okay. So in October of 1838, a French fleet arrived in Mexico and blockaded the city of Veracruz. So they did a whole blockade from any trade routes going in and out of Veracruz.
Yeah.
The Mexicans still refused to pay the 600,000 pesos to this guy, to the pastry chef. The ships began to shell San Juan de Ulia Citadel. So I guess, I don't know, one of the big citadel buildings in San Juan. Mm-hmm. A few minor battles followed this, but by December, as many as 250 soldiers from Mexico had been killed. The famous General Santa Anna even came out of retirement to lead the Mexican army against the French in this war. He actually was wounded by some grape shot and eventually lost his leg because of it.
Because of this Pastry War?
Yeah. And the fighting finally ended in March of 1839. So this lasted about a year, about 9 months, when the British government helped to broker a peace deal between France and Mexico. And as part of the treaty, the Mexicans were forced to pay this Remontel guy 600,000 pesos.
Oh, man.
And it was no doubt a large sum for a pastry shop.
Yeah. He probably skipped town. He's like, I'm going back to France.
Yeah.
I'm going to get killed here.
So kind of like, a whole war, a 9-month war that hundreds of people died, and how many thousands and millions of dollars in potentially damage and everything else, in France sailing ships all the way across the ocean for that. Now, France didn't do it for that guy.
Well, it was about defaulting on their money.
Yeah.
Defaulting on their loans.
Mexico owed them millions of dollars.
Imagine if the U.S. just said, we're not paying our debts. Then I bet you China and Russia and a bunch of these other countries just say, all right, we're going to come take what we're owed, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
like if you don't pay, I'm sure you've seen pictures, videos and stuff of contractors. They people don't pay them, so they just go in and smash everything.
Yeah, they go out and they rip it out.
Yeah, they just like a
or
brand new bathroom
it,
or something. They're just like taking a hammer to the bathroom. It's crazy.
Yeah. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting war. The same kind of situation that France wanted. They were just looking for something to set it off. And what I thought was the funniest part of the whole thing is it was 10 years later. I mean, the guy probably had a whole new life at that point.
Imagine the minutia of requests that the king must have been into to get to see that request.
Yeah, he's looking through like something, anything that has to do with Mexico, bring it to me so I can find something to get mad at them for.
That's hilarious.
So
it's funny that when I think about this, back to the Comanche thing, like how they had a huge population, and it's like, that like their whole territory was basically just ignored. It's like, this is part of Texas now. That's part of Oklahoma. This is part of whatever. That's part of Mexico. And I mean, we just drew lines on the map and we said, okay, this is ours. This is theirs. This is ours. And this is this is Texas and this is Mexico's. And the Comanche were like, yo, we're here.
Yeah. Well,
hello?
I mean, we did exactly to them what they were doing to Mexico.
Yeah.
Except for ours just stuck.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. I guess doesn't matter what the lines were because they were going way into Mexico.
Yeah, I mean they were
into Texas and Oklahoma, and I mean they owned the whole area, regardless of what the lines on the map
yeah.
said.
Well, I mean, but if Mexico would have been stronger, then Mexico would own the area.
Yep.
And so I think it's just kind of the strongest force prevailed.
Yep, exactly. So interesting. There's a lot of small little things like this that sometimes just a small thing can be a flashpoint.
Yeah. How does that
Spark
pertain?
off.
How does that pertain to life? Right. Sometimes in life we just let things fester. Right. Let them boil, and there's kind of like a slow boil, and then you throw some water into a pot of boiling grease, and then it just is a flashpoint. It's just you just explode.
Yeah. Your boss asks you, yeah, can you work a
You're
Saturday?
gonna have to come in on Saturday.
Why don't you just go ahead and come in on Sunday as well? You're like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. So
So
all right. Well, these are cool stories. It's always fun to kind of be able to pull some of these things out of your back pocket and talk to them. I was at I went camping with a bunch of youth from our church. We did kind of a father-son type camp out, and we were all sitting around the fire and we had a little devotional, and then we were kind of telling some stories, and it was kind of cool because I got to. I hadn't done this yet, but I had some other kind of war stories. I actually told the story of the Winter War between Finland and Russia, and told them this story, and it was kind of a war story, kind of like this, but just really cool. And they were all just like, "Oh man, that's so cool!" And it was just, it was cool to be able to tell people. People get excited about history and just cool stories and interesting things.
yeah, totally. That was a cool one. That was from our
Underdog episode.
story. Yeah. In fact, those guys over at
Virtuous Men.
they just posted that this past week. So.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, appreciate you listening, and let's build that creed together.
All right, let's do it.